Hello and welcome. In this video, we're going to be continuing our discussion on the presentation layer. So let's go ahead and get started. We're going to be talking about some of the common Liferay utilities or utility classes that can be used throughout the presentation layer, the controller and the view. Utility classes, or helper classes as we may call them, are a set of classes or tools that allows us to do a number of different things. The main things that we're going to be focusing on are things like being able to retrieve specific parameters from something like the render request or the action request object, manipulate strings and manipulate dates to format them in a way that is more proper, and so on. So the list goes on, but those first two are really going to be the big two that we'll see. We'll also see a little bit of user input validation. So with many of the utility classes that we have, they'll either come as static classes like param_util, or they can come to us as OSGI services, as we see over here in this example. So either way, right, we'll have a number of different ways to invoke these utility classes, but they are available to us in one of those two formats. You can check out some of the documentation that we have in order to see more of those utility classes and what they're able to accomplish for us. Validation. So as we're building out the view layer of our application, as we create things like forms and so on, we want to be able to ensure that the data that's being entered on those forms are correct according to what we deem as correct. So things like email addresses are proper syntax, phone numbers are just numbers, and so on. So why do we want to validate these things? The big one is going to be security. We know that people can try to inject some malicious code by using the forms and the fields that we have made available. So we want validation to be able to ensure that there's nothing funny going on within those forms. Usability, right? We want to be able to provide a good user experience. And by using validation, it allows the users to know when they're doing something properly or when they're doing something incorrectly. And finally, resource usage. If we do validation on the UI side or the client side, this can save us some of the resources that it would take. So some of the forms that we may be familiar filling out, let's say I'm filling out my email address and I go to the next field, validation on the client side will automatically let me know that the email address may not be properly formatted. So that way we don't have to click the save or the submit button for that validation message to reach us, and saves us some of the backend processing power. There's a couple different ways in which we're able to validate the inputs that our users are entering. One of them is client side or on the UI side, as we've just discussed. Using some of the tag libraries, such as the Alloy UI tag library, as well as the Clay library, allows us to validate on the client side. We can also validate on the server side as well. Within our Java classes, we'll have some validation utility classes that can help us out. So two different ways, client side and server side. Here on this slide deck, we have an example of using Alloy UI to help us validate something like a title field. This simple validation just says that there needs to be something in the title field. And if there isn't, we just send this very simple message back over to our end user. We can customize our validators as well, something a little bit more complex, using some logic, some if-else statements, or even some regex allows us to be a lot more flexible with what type of validation we're able to achieve. On the Clay side, right, we have validation as well, having something very similar. So backend validation, we're able to leverage Liferay's validator in order to do validation on the server side or on the backend side. So there's already a Java class or Java utility that can help us out with that. Some things that are worth noting, within the control panel, we can do some configuration on how these inputs might come to us. Again, we know that we don't want any scripting to occur or any injection to occur through the fields that we provide. So Liferay does have some settings that you can leverage through the UI in order to ensure that our inputs are indeed sanitized and that they are something that will not cause us any harm. On the JSP side, we also have some tag libraries that can help us with the validation part as well. We see here on the client side, we have the JSTL tag library to help escape some JavaScript that might be malicious. We also have something that's very similar on the server side or in our Java classes to help strip away, again, anything that's malicious. So some key concepts, some guidelines as we're going through the validation process. We're always going to want to have validation on both the UI side and the back end, so client side and server side. Right? Client side does not guarantee security. That's why we need both. Again, if someone is very clever, and many people are, right, they can circumvent the client side validation. So we always need to have both in order to have a very robust security mechanism. We're going to want to make sure every user input that we have control over. Right? We're taking away the JavaScript, sanitizing it, stripping it of anything that might be of harm. Right? We also want to control the outputs as well. Right? Anything that's being outputted back over to our end users, we're going to want to make sure that those are escaped as well. Right? The next topic we're going to be talking about is feedback. So feedback, again, is just the idea of we want to send messages back over to our end users. Right? When something is done successfully or even unsuccessfully, we want to let our end users know. Liferay provides for us server-side feedback. So in other words, we can, as things are happening in the back end, we can send a message over to the UI side to display to our end users. Right? The two mechanisms or the two classes that we leverage are known as session errors and session messages. So messages are more for general or success messages. Errors, as the name tells us, are for errors. So let's take an example. Over in our portlet class, let's say we have a validator and it's making sure that something is valid, is making sure that something is there. If there's nothing there, then we're going to use the session errors to pass within the request object the string title empty. So here in this example, we're using the validator to check and see whether or not the name is null. So if the name is null, we're going to be using the session errors to add to the request object the string title empty. If there are no errors, we're going to do a check to make sure that there are no errors. Assuming that the session errors is empty, we'll assume that it is successful. So then we'll use the session messages. The main concept or the big idea here, whether we're using session errors or session messages, is using that add method to add to that request object a specific string or specific key. On the JSP side, we're going to be using the Liferay UI tag library to either retrieve from the success messages or the success errors that key that we set. Once we retrieve that key, specified here as key equals, we'll then display a message using the message equals. You'll see that the message is a key. What we'll then do is have another file called language.properties that will provide for us the actual string of the message. So going back one slide, let's talk about that one more time. So whether we're using session errors or messages, we're going to use the add method to add to the request object a specific string. On the JSP side, we're going to be using the Liferay UI tag library to either retrieve that key from the errors or the messages. Once we retrieve that specific key, we'll output the message. What we do at Liferay is we abstract out the message as a key and we provide the actual message in another file called language.properties. We'll talk more about that in the localization section. One thing to note is that when we are working with our portlet components, the portlet component by default will automatically provide a success message. So one thing to note there, if you're going to be implementing your own custom messages, you'll want to turn off the default success message that comes with our portlet components. Here on the screenshot, you'll see the specific line of code that helps you do that. So wrapping things up with feedback and validation, we're going to want to validate the user input on the user interface. Right? We can customize the anti-SAMI to filter input on form submits. Right? That can be done through the control panel. We're always going to want to do backend validation and add messages to the session objects. So we want to do validation on the server side, as well as provide messages back over to our end user. We want validation feedback on the screen. In order to do that, we leverage that Liferay UI tag library to have either success or error messages, or even both. And we're always going to want to validate user contributed output. So very good. That wraps it up for this video, and I will see you in the next video.